When the Witch King of Angmar started his long war against Arnor, he didn't do it alone. In fact, he had help from within Arnor itself during the first phase of the war. These insiders were known as the Hillmen of Rhudaur, but despite playing a large role in the fall of Arnor, we know very little about these Hillmen. We don't know who they were exactly, we don't know where they came from, and we're not even entirely sure what happened to them. In this video, we try to find some of those answers. Firstly, as I often do, I want to talk about what we do know about the Hillmen, just so we're all on the same page. We know that they lived in the wild region that would be known as Rudaur, and later more commonly as the Troll Shores. In the early years of the Third Age, they were a minority within the Kingdom of Arnor, but when Arnor split into 3 successor realms, the Hillmen would find themselves with a great deal of power and influence in the smallest and weakest of these 3 realms, Rudaur. As the Dunedain weakened as the age progressed, this power would only grow. In 1349, Argaleb I would come to the throne in Arthedain, and he would claim all of Arnor, owing to the fact that the line of Isildur had died out in both Cardolan and Rudaur. Rudaur resisted the claim, as sometime before this, a evil lord of the Hillmen had seized control of the kingdom. The Dunedain, now a small, mostly powerless minority. Unbeknownst to the Dunedain, this Lord of the Hillmen was in a secret alliance with the rising power of Angmar, and in 1356 the 2 kingdoms attacked Arthedain, resulting in the death of King Argaleb I. The last Dunedain and Rudaur fled or were killed during the 50-year period that followed. Afterwards, Rudaur and Angmar would be locked in a ceaseless struggle with the rest of Arnor. In 1409 they would launch another assault on Arthedain and Cardolan, this time with much greater success, initially defeating Arthedain and almost completely destroying Cardolan. But following a counterattack by the Elves, the power of Angmar would also be weakened, and following this, Rudaur and the Hillmen are simply no longer mentioned. They are presumably destroyed in 1975, following the destruction of Angmar at the hands of a coalition of surviving Arnorians, Gondorians, and Elves. Alright, so firstly, who were the Hillmen of Rhudaur? Now, this doesn't seem like a big question. They were the Hillmen, right? What else needs answering? Well, the fact that we don't actually know who they truly were or where they came from makes them something of an odd one out when it comes to the men who inhabit the Westlands. For example, we know the origins of men like the Gondorians, the Rohirrim, the Dalemen, the Dunlendings, the Brelanders, and even the mysterious Lossoth. We know who their ancestors were, we know where they originated from, we know who they were related to, and we usually know what language they spoke. This simply isn't true for the Hillmen. All we know is that they dwelt in Rhudaur and were ultimately hostile towards the Dunedain. So who could they have been? As a side note, I'm also going to be talking about the Men of Angmar in this video, who are only referred to once as the Men of Khan Dum. These are the men who, alongside orcs, make up the bulk of Angmar's armies, and their origin is equally as mysterious as the Hillmen of Rhudaur, so I'm going to float a few ideas about who they might have been as well later in the video. As for the Hillmen, there's a couple of possibilities here. Perhaps the safest possibility is that the Hillmen were descended from the Gwathrim, the ancient men who dwelt in the old forested regions of Enedwaith and Midhiriath. There is quite a bit of evidence in favour of this. The Hillmen of Rhudaur seem remarkably similar to the Dunlendings. Both are relatively barbarous peoples who dwelt in hilly regions, and were fiercely protective of their independence, even if it meant launching offensive wars. It would explain their hostility towards the Dunedain, given the Númenóreans were mostly responsible for the destruction of their old homelands, and given how far the descendants of the Gwathrim spread, from the Anduin in the south to Bree in the north, it isn't out of the question that one group ended up settling in the Troll Shores. However, there are some doubts about this theory. As I just said, it isn't out of the question that a group of Gwathrim ended up in the Troll Shores, but it's odd that it wasn't mentioned considering the fact that all other groups of Gwathrim are accounted for, such as the Fisherfolk in Enedwaith, the Dunlendings, and the Brelanders. Also, if the Gwathrim did end up in the Troll Shores, they would have come from the south, and in that case, why did they never settle in Eregion before it became an elven land? It's possible that these Gwathrim were driven to the Troll Shores during Sauron's invasion of Eriador, But then, it seems odd that they would stay and settle in a land in close proximity to elves who they were actually afraid of. There is, however, another possibility that I see as equally likely, that the Hillmen of Rhudaur were originally Easterlings. Thanks to the Grey Annals, we actually know that the descendants of Easterlings dwelt in the north of Rudaur at the beginning of the Second Age. These men are said to have been the people of Bor, and described as being skilled tillers of the earth. Farmers, that is. For those unaware, the people of Bor were the faithful Easterlings of the First Age who fought against Morgoth. So these men in Rudaur were either descendants of those who never crossed the mountains into Beleriand, or recrossed them after Morgoth's victory neared. If the Hillmen of Rhudaur were descended from the Easterlings of Bor, it would make sense as to why their origin was never actually stated. Unlike the Gwathrim, who the Dunedain later came to understand the origins of, the Easterlings of Bor would have been a mysterious people whose origins would have been unclear. But like the Gwathrim, there are certain doubts about this origin as well. It does raise some questions. If the Hillmen were of Bor and were apparently skilled tillers of the earth, why did they reside in a dark, forested, hilly region not suitable for farming? Perhaps they too were forced to flee during Sauron's invasion. And why would they have quarrels with the Dunedain? I mean, this isn't a tough question, there could be any number of reasons, but there isn't the smoking gun like there is with the Gwathrim. It's also possible that the Hillmen were Easterlings but of Uldor rather than Bor. These were the Easterlings that remained true to Morgoth and betrayed the Elves and the Edain in the First Age. After the First Age, these Easterlings were either destroyed or fled back east, and where they ended up is never stated. It's possible that some of these Easterlings ended up in the Trollshores, a place they chose to settle in because it was secluded, defensible, and uninhabited by other men in Rudaur who were likely hostile to them. If these Hillmen were of Uldor, it would make sense as to why they disliked the Dunedain, who were descended from the Edain, their chief rivals during the First Age. But in saying that, the Easterlings of Uldor were not a nice people. They served Morgoth, betrayed their allies, and practiced slavery. It seems unlikely that them and the Dunedain would be able to coexist for over 1,000 years without one attempting to destroy the other rather quickly. Also, from what little descriptive language we have about the Hillmen, it doesn't seem like they were necessarily an evil people. The Hillman chief who sold them out to Angmar is described as an evil lord, and afterwards Rudaur is described as being occupied by evil men subject to Angmar. This seems to imply that not all the Hillmen were happy to bend the knee, or were keen on betraying the Dunedain, something that I don't think befits the Easterlings of Uldor. Maybe they mellowed out over the Second and Third Age, who knows. So those are the three main possibilities in my opinion. The Hillmen might have been a group of Gwathrim who either willingly settled in the Trollshores or were forced to flee there during Sauron's invasion. The Hillmen might have been Easterlings of Bor, who were also forced to flee to the Trollshores during Sauron's invasion, or alternatively, the Hillmen were Easterlings of Uldor, who, fleeing east after the First Age, chose to settle in the Trollshores as it offered them protection and seclusion. Of course, the Hillmen might be a completely non-related group, such as ancient Celts who stepped through a magic portal and ended up in Middle-earth. But these three are the scenarios with evidence, not conclusive and sometimes circumstantial, but evidence nonetheless. Personally, if I had to pick a theory that I find the most likely, I would go with the Easterlings of Bor. It would explain why the origins of the Hillmen are never explained. They didn't belong to a group that was descended from the Edain. It would suggest that they were people with enough merit that they were able to coexist with the Dunedain for a while, but were sufficiently different enough so that problems did occur and war eventually broke out. And it would strengthen my theory about the men who dwelt in Angmar. I mentioned them earlier, the mysterious men of Khand Dûm, and I said I'd talk about their origins as well. Personally, I think it's likely that the men of Angmar were descended from the Easterlings of Uldor. Angmar is a cold, inhospitable land, and it makes very little sense that people would live there willingly, so I think it's probable that its inhabitants were forced to flee there, living far from the other men of Rudaur who would have been hostile to them. And considering how willing the men of Angmar were to accept the Witch King as their king, and to fight alongside orcs, I believe it likely they had a much darker history, once again, much like the Easterlings of Uldor. If the men of Angmar were Easterlings of Uldor, and the Hillmen Easterlings of Boar, it would make sense as to why they eventually formed an alliance. Despite past differences, they would have had similarities in culture and language. So what happened to the Hillmen? As I mentioned earlier, we do know their final fate. They were presumably destroyed, and the lack of inhabitants of Rudaur over 1,000 years later seems to confirm this. But I think the initial fate of the Hillmen would have been different depending on their origin. If they were Gwafarim, I could see them being used as a tool before eventually being discarded by their more powerful northern allies, used as slaves, driven away, or forcibly assimilated. If both groups were Easterlings, it probably would have been more akin to a reunification of ancient peoples. Perhaps many of the Hillmen would have been against such a union at first, but over time, their differences in views would have been superseded by their similarities in language and culture. In a cruel twist of fate, if the Hillmen were Easterlings of Boar, they would have went from fighting against Morgoth to later perhaps unwittingly serving one of his former servants. Regardless of their identity, the end result was the same. Rudaur seems to cease existing after 1409, being absorbed into Angmar proper, and it becomes a nightmarish land, home to dark fortresses occupied by sorcerers and fell spirits, the wilderness infested by orcs and trolls. Perhaps the depopulation had been progressing for a long time, but following the Witch King's defeat at the Battle of Fornost, the lands west of the Misty Mountains were essentially cleansed, purged, genocided, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, the people of Angmar were totally destroyed, and none remained in Angmar and the old kingdom of Rudaur, and it seems to have stayed that way until the end of the Third Age. When Aragorn and the hobbits are passing through 1,000 years later, Aragorn states that the lands have been empty for a long time. The only asterisk is that in The Hobbit, one of Bilbo's trolls claims to have just eaten a village. But who am I going to believe? One of the most learned men alive, or a troll who is being written with Bilbo as the narrator? Anyway, it's kind of a funny way to end the video. Who were the Hillmen of Rhudaur? Doesn't matter. They're all dead. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I like to think I covered two topics with this video, the origin of the Hillmen of Rhudaur and the potential fate of the Easterlings of the First Age. So if you were interested in either or both of those topics, I hope this video has satisfied you. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you live on a hill, you can be a hillman too.